Chapter 14.3 is all about the English unification of the land under one king and the French unification of their land under one king as well. It starts off talking about England. Remember, we said a while ago that England was being ruled by 7 different small-time kings and lords, and they were undergoing massive invasion from the Vikings. You can see the massive invasion from the picture here at the top of the PowerPoint. The people living in England were not of Viking descent. They were of Germanic descent, called Angles and Saxons. And as time went on, sometimes one king of the Angles or Saxons would emerge as a victor over the Vikings and be able to unify more and more of the land. Some of the kings listed that helped to begin unifying England under the control of one man are here: Alfred the Great, Canute, and Edward the Confessor. You can see that Alfred the Great was an Angle, which means that he was of Germanic descent, but Canute was actually a Viking and helped to unify a number of people in England. And then finally, Edward the Confessor. When he dies in 1066, it leads to a war in which England becomes unified under one man finally. The battle is fought between this man here. His name is William the Conqueror, and this man that you see right here, whose name is Harold Godwinson. William the Conqueror was a cousin of the now dead King Edward, and Harold Godwinson was a brother-in-law of the dead King Edward, and they were going to fight over who would inherit what was King Edward's land. William of Normandy was from here. It is on the northern coast of France. He's actually a descendant of Vikings, and he spoke French, so it would be odd for him to be an English king. Whereas Harold was from England, spoke English, but not quite as powerful as William the Conqueror. They fought at the Battle of Hastings, in which Harold is killed. He is in fact shot through the eye with an arrow, which is what you see happening here in this picture. And so William the Conqueror, the Frenchman from Normandy, a descendant of Vikings, then inherits what was King Edward's land. He takes land from many of the lords that had supported King Harold and eventually comes to rule all of England. He keeps 1/5 of all of the land for himself and redistributes all of the rest of the land to people who had fought with him in the war, in the Battle of Hastings. And he takes away lordships from those who had supported Harold. And he then becomes the most powerful king of England up until that point. His descendants would then continue on in a few goals. Number one, trying to gain more land in France, because remember, they were Frenchmen, but now English kings, and keep the king more powerful than the nobles so they don't have to deal with any type of civil war in the future. Henry II is another English king, a descendant of William, and he happens to marry a French princess named Eleanor of Aquitaine. And because he marries her, he adds to his land half of France. And so he's definitely doing goal number one of gaining more land. You can see that England, the land that Henry II owns, includes half of France. So the English are quite powerful at this time. Henry II is the English/French type king who begins to make some changes in society by setting up a common court system with traveling judges. He introduces the idea of having jury trials. The jury is not going to determine the innocence or guilt of the accused man, but in this case, they actually answer questions as witnesses, so it's not the jury that you think of today. And what the judge rules on eventually becomes written down and becomes a written common law in England. So we're moving toward ending the Middle Age type philosophy of unwritten law toward a Renaissance ideal of a written law. Another descendant of William the Conqueror is Richard the Lionhearted, who we spoke of before, who took part in the Third Crusade. He is the man who went to the Middle East and fought against Saladin, the Muslim general, and at the end of that crusade made a peace treaty that kind of favored the Muslims. King John is another descendant of William the Conqueror, and he is a brother of Richard the Lionhearted. He is known for not being a very powerful king. In fact, through warfare, he loses the French lands that Henry had gained for them. He greatly raises taxes to try to gain those lands back, and it causes the nobles to revolt. And they force King John to sign a document called the Magna Carta. You can see that signing happening here in the picture. The Magna Carta was written by the English nobles, and they did so in order to try to limit King John's power over them. In the document, they forced the king to agree that he could no longer raise taxes without conferring with the nobles first. And this is the idea of no taxation without representation. This is the document that gives birth to parliament and congresses throughout the world. King Edward I, not to be confused with any of the earlier Edwards, is the first to want to raise taxes, and so he has to actually summon the parliament. So this is the first time that the group of men in a congress in all of the world is summoned together to decide whether or not they would allow the king to raise taxes. They met in two groups. One was the House of Lords, and one was the House of Commons. The House of Lords included the noblemen and the bishops, and the House of Commons included knights and burgesses, and together they would decide whether or not to allow the king to raise taxes. So you see that the power of the king is now very limited. Moving back over to France, long ago, France had been united under a man named Charlemagne, who was one of the Carolingian kings. The first dynasty in France was the Merovingian dynasty, which had Clovis in it. He was the first Germanic king to convert to Christianity. The final Merovingian king wasn't very powerful, and instead of keeping the kingship within the Merovingian family, the Pope decided to pass it on to the Carolingian family as a thank you to one of the members of the Carolingian family. His name was Charles the Hammer Martel, who had defeated Muslims invading France. So the Carolingian kings included Pepin the Short and Charlemagne. Charlemagne was able to conquer all of the land that you see here in this bottom picture. Unfortunately, Charlemagne's descendants fought over the land, and it ended up dividing up into 3 portions, and then later on divided up into more portions until it represented, I think, 47 different lords and kingships once again. So it is disintegrating into a chaotic feudal system. The final Carolingian kings, they'll die out and be replaced by a new family. Hugh Capet is the first of this new family of kings called the Capetian family. And they only rule one small section. You can see here, this is the section that the Capetians rule, and they will eventually conquer more and more land in order to unite France into one solid country. Philip II is a Capetian king, so he's a descendant of Hugh Capet, and he is sometimes referred to as Philip Augustus because he was such a great king. He is the man who actually takes Normandy from King John. Remember, King John of England was the king who greatly raised taxes in an effort to keep his French lands, but failed, and then was forced to sign the Magna Carta. So his enemy was this Frenchman you see up here, Philip II. And Philip II, this French king, this French Capetian king, is greatly renowned in French history as taking France back from the English. He makes some changes into the landscape, much like earlier English kings had done, by sending out traveling judges in order to patrol the lands and the laws within the lands, and bailiffs to collect taxes for his dynasty. Eventually, there'll be more Capetian kings. Louis IX is another Capetian king. He creates an appeals court. The people of the land are very much appreciative of having appeals courts. So if they do not agree on the judgment that has been passed down upon them, they can appeal it and possibly get it changed. And he was eventually canonized into the Catholic Church as a saint. Philip IV was one of the Capetian kings who actually gets into a fight with the Pope. When the Pope forbids bishops to pay taxes to the French king, Philip decides that he is going to call together a meeting of all of the important people in France in order to convince them that bishops should pay taxes to the French king. And so this is the first time a parliamentary type group gets together in France. They're called the Estates General. There are 3 groups of them. Remember, there were only 2 groups within England, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. In France, their parliament meets in 3 groups: the First Estate, the Second Estate, and the Third Estate. And they really just get together so they can listen to Philip IV speak about his controversy with the Pope. The Estates General has no power to govern any decisions over the French king. They can simply vote on whether or not they support or do not support his decisions, but that support means nothing to the king, who can then do as he wishes. So you see here that we have the establishment of an English parliament and a French parliament, the French parliament being called the Estates General. Both of them are put into place to limit the power of nobles, but also to limit the power of kings. The parliament in England is able to control the money, the purse strings of the king, by saying that they will not increase taxes unless they vote upon it, whereas the Estates General in France is not able to force the king into any particular decisions.